Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about the poetry of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So I actually got a request to do a video on Coleridge, or more videos on the Romantic poets more generally, but Coleridge specifically. So Coleridge is an interesting guy in the canon of the Romantics. In some ways, he's a sort of lesser version, in some ways, of a lot of the other Romantic poets. So he does a lot with nature imagery, but he's not quite as good at it as Wordsworth. He works on ballads and these sort of storytelling or folk songs, but he's not necessarily as good at it as someone like Robert Burns. He's got this sort of sadness element to him, to his work, but it's not as distinct or as interesting as somebody like Keats. So he's not necessarily regarded as one of the greatest Romantic poets, but he's definitely in that sort of, if you got Byron, Keats, Shelley, yeah, so I mean, I would say they're sort of the top three is Byron, Keats, and Shelley. Then your sort of second tier is probably Robert Burns, who's on sort of the fringes. William Blake is kind of on the fringes. These are both poets who are somewhat romantic, but not necessarily fully in there. Robert Southey is in that group, and I would actually say Coleridge is in that group as well, simply because he's not necessarily as spectacular as some of the main ones. That being said, he's actually got a lot of really interesting poems, and one of the reasons that some of his poetry is as interesting as it is because he was addicted to laudanum for a lot of his life. And laudanum, which was basically opium mixed with alcohol, was an extremely popular drug in the Romantic era, the Regency era. To a certain extent, it was a sort of all-purpose painkiller, so it was something like Advil in the sense that everybody had some of it as a sort of general painkiller, but it was also, it is still opium, and so it was highly addictive and had hallucinogenic properties. And so a lot of Coleridge's poetry is actually sort of almost psychedelic at times, with these really sort of interesting images and sort of bizarre connections and ideas and things like this. So that is the thing that makes him really quite interesting as a Romantic poet, despite the fact that as a craftsman he's not necessarily as good as a lot of the others. So I want to take you through bits and pieces of a couple of his poems and sort of talk through this. So one of his most famous poems is Kubla Khan, which is this really interesting, almost dream poem set in the 13th century, about, obviously, Kubla Khan, who was Genghis Khan, I think is actually how Mongolians pronounce it. In the West, we tend to call him Genghis Khan, but Kubla Khan was the second ruler of the Mongol dynasty, the Mongol Empire, and whereas Genghis Khan was much more of like I'm going to live in a yurt, on the move, nomadic style, very basic warrior, horseman type thing. Kubla Khan became much more comfortable with luxury much more comfortable with the kinds of palatial homes that the Chinese and Persian and Indian rulers lived in. And so Coleridge imagines this palace, this sort of stunning palace that Kubla Khan builds, as a sort of paradise that runs up against nature. So I think I'll just go ahead and read you the whole thing. It's got, I think, one of the best opening stanzas anywhere in poetry. Kubla Khan. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and here were gardens bright with sinuous rills where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, and here were forests ancient as the hills enfolding sunny spots of greenery. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedar cover, a savage place, as holy and enchanted as ere beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-interred burst huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail, and mid these dancing rocks at once and ever it flung up momently the sacred river. 5 miles meandering with a mazy motion through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. And mid this tumult Kubla heard from far ancestral voices prophesying war. The shadow of the dome of pleasure floating midway on the waves was where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain in the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such delight 'twould win me, that with music loud and long I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair. Weave a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. So it's actually a great poem, and it has a great sound and great rhythm to it, but it is this sort of dream poetry exploration of this imagined ancient event, the building and destruction of this palace. And one of the things that is really worth noting here is that this is what we would now call Orientalism. This is very clearly sort of imagining a barbaric splendor of the Far East, which, of course, the Romantics were very much invested in sort of imagery of East Asia, the ideas of Buddhism, which were just starting to filter into Europe in the early 19th century and things like this. So there is that element here of sort of fascination with the exotic. And again, it's this sort of dream vision of a major event. I want to read you just one more stanza, just a bit from Dejection and Ode, because again, one of the other things that we have with Coleridge is that melancholy and that fascination with nature that we have with other Romantic poets who, generally speaking, I think do it better. But I really do love this third stanza in Dejection and Ode, so I want to give you this too. All this long eve, so balmy and serene, have I been gazing on the western sky in its peculiar tint of yellow-green, and still I gaze, and with how blank an eye! For those thin clouds above, in flakes and bars, that give way their motion to the stars, those stars that glide between them or behind, now sparkling, now bedimmed, but always seen, yon crescent moon as fixed as if it grew in its own cloudless, starless lake of blue, I see them all so excellently fair, I see, not feel, how beautiful they are. So again, we've got all of this nature imagery, moons, stars, clouds, the sky, and we've got that sort of melancholy, I see, not feel how beautiful they are. This sort of sense of loss and detachment from the natural world that for the Romantics so often represented this sort of ideal access to beauty, even if that sort of beauty and truth was fleeting and momentary.